The audience would like to talk on this issue. Okay, seeing no one, Mr. Natoli.
Well, Mr. Chair, we certainly recognize some of the time constraints here, but I think this is an important enough issue, and it kind of goes to Patrick's question a moment ago. I think that fairness just dictates in this case, no matter how much we've talked about this, to at least give the county and their elected representatives an opportunity to weigh in on this, and certainly to hear the conversation that the council has had and discussion. And so I guess I would offer a substitute motion that we, again, I don't know what it does logistically to some of the things that are contemplated for motions and so forth this afternoon as we look at this, but I would ask that we hold this over and give an opportunity for the county to either appear before this council. I don't know if, we talked yesterday about maybe having another meeting or whatever, but to have an opportunity to...
Well, let me make a suggestion. I believe the county of Contra Costa is in business today. This is not a furlough Friday for them or anything like that. I cannot believe we can't find someone. You called supervisor people to get an answer, have not received a request back. The county planning guy who sent the letter is on vacation. May I suggest to you that we take the substitute motion and Randy's motion. We put it over for 1 hour. We ask one of our staff to call the county executive's office and ask, do you have a position as to whether for purposes of the Delta Plan, Bethel Island should be a legacy community? Yes or no? If you have a position, yes or no, why do you have that position? I mean, there's a point at which the entire Delta Plan of the state of California should not be delayed pending this resolution because of one county supervisor who was not available when you called and the staff who's on vacation. I mean, it's just nuts to do that. That'd be my suggestion. Ms. Messer, will you take care of that? Is that acceptable to you, Don?
That's fine.
Randy? Okay, it is now 9:40. Let's plan no later than 11 o'clock, and staff yell at me on that to get a report back from the county officials. Then we'll take up the substitute motion first, and then Mr. Fiorini's motion.
But I don't know if you even have a second on substitute motion.
I'll ask for that.
Oh, okay. So go ahead. Okay.
Ms. Gray?
I'll second the substitute.
Okay, Ms. Gray. We'll take up Don's motion first. Okay. All right, let's go on. Don, are you ready to discuss the habitat questions?
Sure.
Okay. Members, file item 7 and file item 8 from the council action checklist. You'll recall we discussed this yesterday. These are the habitat maps which have been around. I think they've been in all the versions of the Delta Plan, or almost all the versions from the start.
Yeah, the first item is the revised policy ERP2, which is direction about how habitat restoration should occur. And the current policy, and it has been in various variations, but largely, unchanged since April of 2011. It was introduced in the third staff draft, and it says that habitat restoration should be carried out consistent. It had said carried out consistent with the elevation map, that's attached, and with the text of Appendix H. And Appendix H is the draft conservation strategy for the Sacramento Delta that's been prepared by Fish and Game. And, the reason for referencing that was it's a great compilation of the best science about how the restoration could occur. What we were trying to do with this modification was respond to a request from the Department of Water Resources that, in looking at the map, said, due to its small size and the presence of potential errors, it may be better used as guidance. And so they suggested this variation in language from the long-term language we have had over the years. And we checked it with Fish and Game, and they were quite comfortable with this. Okay. And the appendix itself has been part of the plan that has been before the council since the third staff draft back in April.
Okay. Don, then Randy.
Thank you, Dan. And again, last night I had a chance to review Appendix H. I guess a couple of things, and I raised one yesterday that we have a draft document. I assume at some point in time that will no longer be a draft, but that becomes a permanent part of our plan. And if it's still a draft, that becomes incorporated as the guidance for the Delta Plan. And so I still have a bit of a question mark around that as to if that plan were to be modified. And I think even the chair raised yesterday, you start on page 30, you just take the relevant section, and that becomes the appendix. It doesn't really even give you the. It seemed to me you would have the full text in here without burdening our document. I don't know how big that text is, but you start on a page where you have a carryover paragraph. But I guess the concern, and I appreciated Joe's response to it yesterday too, that with some minor alterations that we, by reference, then incorporate this as being the guidance. And I guess my question probably goes more to P3 than it does to P2, because those exhibits are part of the plan. The appendix references the text that, again, we haven't developed that. That's the work that they've put forth, their work product. But P3, what that means when we have restoration opportunity areas, what that means to landowners, the reservation that people get on somebody else's land. Some of it may be in public ownership, but certainly not all of those restoration areas by any means are. And then this avoidance, because I think it again puts another layer, recognizing certainly the habitat potential, and there's also, this ties back to the floodway reservations. What sort of limitations, either for landowners or other public agencies, because if I understand this, and I had a conversation as I was leaving last night with Melinda Terry and Mike Hardesty about this, is, for example, if you have other local projects that folks are looking to do, and they wish to mitigate here, and or their project affects those areas, do they have to then look for other areas, or do they have to mitigate for loss of those opportunities that would be diminished, even though these are still privately held lands? I mean, that's a lot bundled in one question, but it kind of goes back to the essence of what ROP means, ROA, or opportunity area. What does that mean? And then how, from the standpoint of consistency or covered actions, that begins to integrate itself into people's ability to either do local and or other agencies to do projects, and or landowners' abilities to have flexibility with the use of their property.
Would it make sense to then dispose of the item 7 first and then move on to item 8 so that we could?
You want to do that?
Yeah, I think I'm okay with item 7. I mean, basically you're referencing what's on the map, except for, again, you're now mapping one more thing on, even though it's included in the report. I mean, that was the connection I had, Mr. Chair, was that. Okay, well,
let's do this. If you're okay on number 7, I'd at least like to resolve that. Can we get a motion on number 7? Mr. Fiorini, Don, is that okay with you?
Yes.
Okay, you want to second it? You want to not second it?
Well, the one thing I would offer is that we ought to have some modification to the appendix, so what this document, this appendix is just, it starts on page 30 and it rolls right into it. You don't even know what the cover document to that plan is, and so there ought to be some.
We'll include the cover early. Actually, when it was the third draft of the plan, actually did have the cover of the document as part of the appendix, okay. And so we could add that back in.
All right. So if the motion is to approve number 7 with the modification on Appendix H to clarify the source of the title of the document and the deletion of the unnecessary part paragraph that appears on the first page, that's what you're interested in? Okay. Is there a second on that? Second. Okay. Starting with Mr. Johnston. Call the roll, please.
Johnston, aye.
Gray, aye.
Fiorini, aye.
Eisenberg, aye.
Totally, aye.
Okay. 5-0 on that. With the amendment. On item number 8 now, please, ERP3. Don.
Okay, well, I think I got into that. I kind of melded my comment. That's where I think the primary concern lies here, whatever areas are designated and how it impacts certainly any project components for whether it's water projects or their own habitat projects. I mean, if the state basically lays claim to these areas for their own purposes of mitigation and or conservation or preservation, then how that comports either with HCPs or other local project advancements in having to look to other areas or have to mitigate if they do something in those areas. I mean, I guess I need to have some better understanding about that, because and I see Melinda was approaching the podium. I know she had some concerns too.
Okay, Randy, question.
Yeah, and I want to echo the concern. As a grower, there are times when we want to convert open land to orchards and vineyards, and that would run afoul of this policy. in an area of uncertain development, an uncertain habitat restoration potential.
Well, that's not
Yeah.
true. That is not true. This restriction only applies
To covered action.
to covered actions, and growers can change their crops. They can do any number of things, and that's not a public agency making a decision. It is not subject to any kind of governmental approval and is not something that would be covered by this action. What would be covered is if somebody wants to come in, a public agency wants to come in and do something or approve some major project in these areas that might preclude restoration. So that's the only thing that's there. So agriculture continuing on is not covered by this.
Okay, that's a good clarification. Now, if the reclamation district wishes to put in a pumping station or a flood control project in that area, is that considered a covered action? And shouldn't they be allowed to continue to do that? And then if it ever does become a habitat restoration area, be reimbursed for the replacement, removal, relocation of that?
So,
This is a discussion that's been ongoing for a long time, and perhaps only by sharpening the focus on these restoration areas has it been clear.
Yeah.
When the council first in the third staff draft began to consider this issue, the proposal was a policy that would prevent activities that would interfere with restoration opportunities, period. And people were concerned that that wasn't flexible enough. And so the provision was added that that if there were actions that were going to interfere with restoration, there had to be some mitigation for that. That might be through the design of a project to reduce the interference. It might be through the location of a project to shift something so it minimizes the interference. When I think about an action that could interfere with restoration, one example could be a road improvement that didn't include adequate area for passage of water back and forth of the road. You're just going to put it under fill with a minimum amount of culverts instead of leaving an area with a big enough expanse for water to flow back and forth through an area. And so then the mitigation in that case would be, you would probably redesign that structure. And that was the policy that was in place when the fifth draft and the EIR were circulated. It applied to the entire Delta. In response to concerns we heard from local governments that this was too expansive a policy, it did have restrict actions in many places. And in places where that would be, where there was no real prospect for restoration. Then we tried to narrow that application by focusing on these areas that seemed to have the highest potential for restoration. We're in the middle of a process in the early stages of a restoration process that just to continue operating under the biological opinions is going to require between 10 and 30,000 acres of restoration. And the BDCP conversation is about, up to 100,000, perhaps more, I've heard acreage discussed. And so it's going to take decades, if we do this right, to get through that restoration process. This is an overlay zone that prevents actions that would interfere with those future opportunities unless there was some mitigation to try to work out whatever issues there might be. If we fail to reserve these restoration areas, we risk being in the situation where we're never able to comply with the biological opinions. We're never able to do the restoration that the BDCP may call for. And so we're trying to make sure that we're protecting our options so that we can actually manage this delta in a way that gets us where we need to go.
I can understand if somebody's proposing to build a county transportation maintenance facility or a hotel or something like that. But there's no differentiation here between a flood control project and a pumping station versus some sort of major development. And that's the sticking point as far as I'm concerned, because in these areas, they're largely operated by reclamation districts and special districts that have some degree of responsibility and may need to do something out there. And it just seems a little overreaching to ask them to mitigate for something that may never happen.
Well, let's walk through. First, let's walk through the reclamation districts, what they can do. Right now, they're exempt for any maintenance activities. So the only thing that we're talking about is if they want to go in and build a new construction, do a significant upgrade to a levee. This policy is not the only one that impacts them. They're also supposed to look at setback levees, other things like that. The same is true for a pump station. And it seems clear to me that if they're going to do something that would impact restoration opportunities in the future, that's something that they ought to be looking at and we ought to be looking at now. So if somebody wants to go in and build a fat levee or an enhanced PL 8499 levee in an area where we think there's potential for key restoration in the future, it is something that I think the council ought to step up and say, look at this really carefully, and we don't make the judgment. Remember, the individual agency actually makes the judgment, looks at it and says, okay, there is the potential for habitat here. We need to look at all these things carefully, and if we're hurting the potential for that, then we need to mitigate that. That seems only reasonable in a place where we've limited it to the critical habitat areas. I think it would be bad public policy to just kind of ignore the fact that we know what the critical habitat areas are. We've identified them in this proposal. We're expanding it slightly. But these are things that virtually everybody agrees are the key areas for restoration. That was a key part of the legislation. And for us to just say, well, but it doesn't apply if you're doing this, just does not seem to me that that's reasonable. And if it's a small project, then it's likely to have minimal impact. A pump station is not as likely to have a footprint of a tenth of an acre or something. You know, it's not likely to be something that causes the kind of problems that maybe people are envisioning. Frankly, I don't think that most levee projects would cause that. But I think it's also incumbent on the council as part of the plan to step up and say, yes, these are critical areas, and yes, we are going to ask the agencies who are doing these projects to look at what they might be doing that will impact our ability to carry out the goals of the state.
And I understand the need to preserve the opportunity and to do no further harm. I understand that approach. So you're saying, Joe, your interpretation of ERP3 is that there are projects that would have low or minimal impact that in the discretion of the covered action proponent could elect not to call out this particular policy and continue to build that without mitigation.
Or to say,
and
we're
possibly
gonna do
get
this,
challenged
but,
later.
Or to say, we're going to do this project, and here's how we're going to mitigate it, or here's how we're going to plan for what might occur in the future so that it has minimal impact. I'm afraid that if we don't say, yes, you need to really think about this by having a policy here, the natural inclination is just to continue with business as usual.